I do believe it's time. I'll just let this slideshow roll on a little bit while I provide some opening remarks. On behalf of the Experimental Analysis of Human Behavior Special Interest Group, EOPSIG, I'd like to welcome and thank all of you for attending today's session. As time is of the essence, I must keep my opening remarks brief to allow the panelists as much time as possible. Each year, the SIG selects an individual whose career achievements have significantly impacted and advanced the science of behavior analysis. This year's award presentation is particularly special. The SIG chose to recognize Dr. Nathan Azrin, a true pioneer in the field of behavior analysis. Sadly, we have recently lost Dr. Azrin. Thanks to the efforts of Ted Aon, we have assembled this panel discussion of distinguished colleagues to reflect upon Dr. Azrin's life and career. I am very grateful to the panelists for taking time and effort to participate in this session and travel at relatively short notice to be here with us today. So thank you very much. The SIG is also honored to have members of Dr. Azrin's family in attendance today. If the Azrin family would please rise for some recognition. Thank you. Dr. Azrin earned his PhD from Harvard under B.F. Skinner in 1957. In a career spanning more than 50 years and over 200 publications, Dr. Azrin embodied the scientist practitioner model, having conducted pioneering work in basic, translational, before there was such a term, translational and applied behavior analysis. A few of his numerous achievements include advancing our understanding of aversive control of behavior, introducing applied technologies which are now commonplace, such as the use of timeout from positive reinforcement and token economies, and advancing clinical practice by developing interventions for drug and alcohol dependence, Tourette syndrome, depression, marital dysfunction, parenting, and probably the largest impacts in his efforts in developing techniques for rapid toilet training. Many parents have avoided a lot of aversive stimulation as a result of that work. And finally, chronic unemployment, to name but a few. Indeed, reviewing Dr. Azrin's curriculum because is humbling. There's enough work there to span 5-6 careers, all tied into one. Dr. Azrin was also a committed steward of the discipline by serving as editor of the journal Experimental Analysis of Behavior, helping to found the Midwestern Association for Behavior Analysis, which has evolved into ABA-I, as we know it today. And he also helped to launch the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis. So it's easy to say, without his repertoire, behavior analysis would be very, very different. On behalf of the SIG, I am honored to present the 2013 AHB SIG Career Award to the Azrin family. Systematic exploration of the use of token economies at N State Hospital. Dr. Yeoman is a professor emeritus of psychology from Georgia State University and maintains a private practice in Atlanta. He has published over 90 scientific articles and 5 books on therapeutic methods involving the emotional and behavioral problems of adults, teenagers, and children. He received his undergraduate and MA degree in psychology from the University of Kansas and his PhD in clinical psychology from the University of Houston. Dr. Yeoman is a fellow of the American Psychological Association, a member of the Georgia Psychological Association, and holds certification, and he's a diplomat in clinical psychology for ABPP. Please help me welcome Dr. Yeoman.
Well, it's not easy to follow started, but I thought today what I could do, because it's not easy to follow up on something like what he has done. So I thought what I would tell you is a little bit about him that ordinarily you may not know about. Imagine going into a condemned building where there is a tremendous amount of space, where as you enter this condemned building, what you see is sort of like snow on the ground. There are white flecks all over the place, and some of them are falling from the ceiling. Meantime, you're also listening to click-clack, click-clack, click-clack all over the place. And then there's a chum, pa-chum, pa-chum. Well, what is happening is that the research with wonderful palomas, let's say in Espanol, it's little pigeons. And these pigeons have a lot of feathers, and the feathers are going all over the place. Meantime, a lot of people are scurrying around doing what appears to be very feverish activity. This is my first day at work. And so I'm wondering, what is going to happen here? Because there isn't anything like an administration office or anyone to really guide you into at least your room or something. There's nothing like that. Everybody's everywhere. Nate, not surprisingly, is going from one place to the other. Everybody else is doing something. You're not too sure what they're doing, except they're going into places where there are all these different chambers for different species of animals, for that matter. And again, they're all having fun. It seems like they're all having sort of like, they're playing. That was my impression. They're all playing, and they're having such a good time. And so finally, Nate comes around and says, have you found a place? I said, no, where should I be? He said, just find a corner somewhere. And if you need anything, call around Bill. That was somebody who knew where things were. Well, it meant there was no chair, no desk, and in fact, no place except what you decided would be your place. Of course, that was the beginning of the work that actually started me on this road. I felt that we're having such a great time that the least I could do is sort of copy what they were doing. And so I started trying to get to know how they put the leads in these different racks. I didn't know anything about it. I had never worked with animals. And so I thought, but they're having such a good time. And, they're researchers and so on. I was very impressed with that. I thought it'd be nice if I joined them. It didn't take but a couple of 3 days before it just happened. It took 3 days, that's all it was. Nate stopped me with just one question and said, what are you doing? I said, just trying to find out how to get the birds to do this and that. And I don't understand this too well, but I'm trying. And he says, why would you want to do that? And I said, you're having such a good time. I'd like to join you. And he said, no, stop that. You're the only one who does human work. You're the only one who does applied stuff. You should do what you're good at. Well, I abandoned, rather prematurely, you might say, my efforts to join experimental and animal work, and in fact dedicated the rest of the time, not surprisingly, to really building what became later on the token economy. One other thing about Nate, he was an unselfish person. He was not competitive, which a lot of places people get competitive, particularly a lot of researchers. He was not competitive. He promoted people. He would always tell me about one of the other people who was doing whatever they were doing. He was so glad to tell somebody about their good work. And so after a while you realize that you were accepted, not what you did. You had somebody who was actually supporting your work. He was definitely the best person to do research with. There were no meetings. Think about that. If you're doing research at all, you know, you got meetings on Wednesdays or Mondays and this and that, and the staff meetings. You don't have to drive a person into the academic world. And as we know, the academic world is full of these meetings. You know. Hard stuff. Anyway, one of the things that I thought I'd share with you is that since we didn't have meetings, you wondered how did anybody do research? Well, everybody got a chance to be with Nate one-on-one. In other words, there was no reason to have a chance to an audience. Because Nate was the one who would actually let each person know about the others, in a sense of details, what they were doing. And ordinarily, I never heard Nate saying, I mean, he's not doing well, I mean, he's having trouble. I never heard anything like that. All I heard was positive stuff about everybody he worked with. A remarkable thing, let me tell you. Research is not easy, it's not for the faint of heart. So, these are the qualities of the man we have, and that we're honoring today. And I want to thank you very much for being in the audience. Okay, thank you.
Our next speaker is Dr. Ronald R. Hutchinson. Dr. Hutchinson received his master's degree from Southern Illinois University under the direction of Dr. Asner. He then went on to Yale, where he earned a second master's degree en route to earning a PhD. Dr. Hutchinson has authored over 50 articles, book chapters, and invited manuscripts. He also holds several U.S. patents related to behavioral technology. Dr. Hutchinson has served as the Director of Research for the Michigan Department of Mental Health and has been adjunct professor at Southern Illinois University and Western Michigan University. Dr. Hutchinson is currently the chairman of the Board of Trustees and research director for the Foundation for Behavioral Research in Augusta, Michigan. The foundation, which Dr. Hutchinson founded, is a not-for-profit corporation sponsoring research, development, and service provision of behavioral technology towards personal competence and self-sufficiency. The services are tailored to 3 areas of need: early education and guidance for children, employment assistance for unemployed adults, senior home support, and home health support. The Early Education Program is the largest centrally managed nonprofit child care, preschool, elementary school program in Michigan and the 15th largest in the nation. The Employment Program has guided over 126,000 unemployed welfare-dependent adults to employment and has saved Michigan over $200 million in income support payments. This effort approximately 10% of the total state-sponsored welfare client employment assistance during the past 10 years. His work with seniors involves operating as a network of nursing and social services caseworkers and in-home helpers. The senior support program assists hundreds of seniors to continue independent living. As you can see, Dr. Hutchinson's followed in his mentor's footsteps by going from the basic lab and taking things out into the real world and bringing about pronounced social significant behavioral change. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Hutchinson.
Thanks, Eric. Thanks to Ava. You say Ava with the I there? I've taken a path somewhat different than an academic career, and though I read the journals which this group publishes, for the most part I haven't had much association over the years. I was at the founding meeting back at MPA a little over 50 years ago, and I tell you, you can't turn around for even half a century, but you people are jumping all over the world. It's amazing. My retrospective is going to be very much like Ted's. I started on a journey to graduate education in 1958. In fact, I believe that the Azrin family And my family came to Carbondale, Illinois in approximately the same month. Or maybe he was a month earlier because he had to purchase a house, get settled. In the course of taking a course called Research Methods in the Behavioral Sciences, and as I was sitting in class that first day in September, a young fellow came in, introduced himself, wrote his name on the board. It was Nathan Asner. And although it did not occur to me at the time, it couldn't, I didn't have the perspective. The course content very much is a metaphor to the road that I'm sure that Nate traveled in his eventually becoming the outstanding behavioral scientist and practitioner that he was. The course studied the classic social psychology and psychology studies which have been published, some of them group studies, some of them simply questionnaire studies. And in context, teaching the young students in that class the elemental processes of knowing something and really knowing it. You understand the experimental method, control groups, et cetera, et cetera. The last thing that was introduced was a strange collection of papers called Symposium on Operations that took place at Harvard. And you know probably, a number of you, that one of the papers given at that series of highfalutin, high theory meetings was a paper by Fred Skinner, where he talked about the ways of really doing research case history and scientific method. And to me, later it was clear that Nate had followed this path as a young social psychology student. In all 9 sessions, having bumped into Og Lindsley, arguing about behaviorism, et cetera, having a chance to move over and see some behavioral work at Harvard, and then jumping in, feet first and forevermore. Well, another bit of recollection. Nate invited the students of this class to visit the research lab if they liked, and I did so within, I think, a few weeks after the beginning of the class. And he showed me around a space just as Ted has described. It's, if you know what a 100-year-old state mental hospital ward looks like, this ward being an abandoned ward, 50 years of paint peeling off the ceilings, several day rooms, a whole series of smaller rooms where patients spent the evening and days too in either seclusion or whatever. Heavy grids on the windows. This was, and when I first walked in, I remember so vividly finding my way there, told to go up on the 2nd floor, and there was this pink 8.5 by 11 piece of paper scotch taped to the glass window in the door of the entrance to this old ward. It said, research lab. And so I talked with Dr. Essen at that time, Nate came to me, and he was in an unhappy mood. He'd been there a month and a half, and all that had come in for his efforts to get going with some research was a box of Ralph Gerbrand's cumulative recorder paper. He says, what do I need with the recorder paper? I don't have any recorders, I don't have any animals, et cetera, et cetera. All right. Over the next few months, I started working there on a volunteer basis. By Christmas, he had 2 rat boxes and a pigeon box going. Work in punishment for the most part. Work in the nice shop run by or manned by a quite competent technician who'd been trained in the Army. He was also working feverishly to try and improve the mechanical equipment in a variety of ways. Something that's always, that I've never been able to put in place with Nate. As best I know, Nate never showed a particular interest in hobbies or whatever with mechanical gadgets. Me, on the other hand, I was an engineer when I went down there, so that kind of stuff grabbed me. But it didn't stop Nate from asking the most basic questions and forcing the technologies to evolve so that they were more perfectly meshed with the questions he wanted to ask. I'm just stunned by this. And of course, he showed it in a variety of ways in the human work later. Well, all right, I need to move on rapidly here. Because I was a student in psychology, actually sponsored in the rehabilitation counseling program, I didn't think it was suitable that I do an animal study for my master's degree. And in fact, he encouraged me to take one of the old patient rooms and turn it into a test chamber, which with a struggle I did over the next some months. And by around the first of the year also, we're talking now just early 1959, I had a chamber which he thought might be adequate, and I began studying some severely ill male patients using cigarettes as a reinforcer. Worked well with some of these patients that were 3 and 4 bag, roll your own folks a day. And got, by the end of that next year, when I formally began the experiments, I got some orderly performance. I didn't know why I was doing that really, although I was reading feverishly at the time. It became clear that Nate loved Og Lindsley, but had some question about whether the Lindsley definition of psychosis, i.e. simply a pause in operant behavior, was a suitable functional analysis. And he pressed me to show that if you choose the reinforcers right, well, you get orderly and continuous behavior, which seems to subtend the times when these displays otherwise might take place. Something that, of course, Nate showed in grand style and in a living conditions setting to be the way to go. I went away in the summer, late summer of '60 to do advanced work out east. And before I left, Bill Holtz showed up, told me he wanted to do a doctoral dissertation. And Nate, of course, by then had about 4 boxes clicking and clacking, that is their relays, in the control room, and had really done some nice work to perfect, if you'll pardon me. Apparently it's not politically correct. I'm distressed at this for no reason, but to be able to carefully and accurately deliver an aversive stimulus to a creature. Something that was not possible, really. That is, the inaccuracy and the variability was untenable in terms of any long-term understanding. Bill then began, after my departure, to do his studies with Nate on punishment. Just before I left, a chap by the name of Roger Ulrich came in and wanted to do his doctoral thesis. And Nate and Izzy Goldiamond had, with much frustration, been putting 2 rats in a box to try and replicate the Miller observations that you could, by turning shock off, reinforce attack behavior between this pair of animals. Something that seemed intuitively quite natural. But it was, I spent a dozen nights with Izzy and with Nate, just watching them tear their hair out, because these animals were fighting anyway. I remember Nate leaving their room and They find anyone. They find. Well, he was obviously in the midst of a paradigm which, when the shock occurred, caused the fighting, and when the shock then was contingently put in abeyance, reinforced such postures and continuance. And a paradigm, by the way, of the operant reinforcement of respondent aggression, which was much later put to formal examinations, some 6 or 8 years later. And Roger, Dr. Ulrich, took up these studies and did a nice job of parametric examination of parameters. Well, I went out east for 2 years, and when I came back in '62, if I'm correct, Ted and I walked into the lab at virtually the same time. He was off like a rocket. He makes it sound like he did a bunch of animal research, but he had that lab clicking pretty good within a couple of months, if I remember. One of the richest personal parts of, and Ted has set the stage, of working with Nate, and in that setting, was that you were elbow to elbow many times a day, and you had fun talking about what was happening with each other's work. But there was also a precious, particularly in my later return time, where a group of us, to avoid all driving the 20 miles over this winding road, would pal up in a carpool situation. And although we solved a lot of the world's problems, we also did a whole bunch of planning for next research projects in that context also. When I came back, I don't know, I guess Nate liked the way I built that room or something, but he sent me off. He'd just been given permission to get more space. And so there was another abandoned lower level wing. Actually, you would call it a basement. It was half in the ground and half out. And so my first research project was to get to this much expanded space going. And I got him in trouble a couple of times because I kept gobbling up more space than the superintendent really agreed to, but it all worked out pretty good in the end. Don Hake, in the spring of '61, came out, said he wanted to do his doctoral thesis, and if you've read his work, he and Nate did some wonderful things, both with punishment paradigms, developing the primate paradigm for doing aversive control, and also doing some very subtle conditioned punishment and comparison of various reinforcement schedules of punishment. After the lab was hopping again, I dove into to more aggression work, and that was very fulfilling. It was just the richest time to have Ted and Don Hake and myself and Nate be able to spend the time talking together. I can't tell you how reinforced in every sense that was. And as a result, there was all of us in one way or another put out a very high rate. Nate was a giant among us, not perhaps in his first steps, but it is my absolute belief that 100 years from now he will be accorded the same respect and admiration for his work in public health medicine that a Lister or a Pasteur and a number of other behavioral people that have followed his footsteps. We're all very fortunate to have had Nate, and my whole career since then is a result of his work with me.
Our next speaker is Dr. Brad Donahue. Dr. Donahue received a PhD from Nova Southeastern University and currently holds the rank of Professor of Psychology at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. Dr. Donahue is Director of Family Research and Services, which is chiefly focused on the development, evaluation, and dissemination of family-supported interventions to assist in goal achievement. He is one of the developers of Family Behavioral Therapy, FBT, and evidence-based treatment listed in many national clearinghouses. His specific interests include the development and adoption of evidence-based treatments, primarily FBT, psychometric development of clinical measures to assist in understanding and measuring treatment outcomes, and improving the functioning of mental health clinics through effective supervision and quality assurance. Those primary interests concern troubled populations, for example, substance abuse, child maltreatment, family violence, and conduct disorders. He is also interested in the concurrent improvement of mental health and sports performance in athletes. Dr. Donahue has published over 120 manuscripts, is a recipient of the Western Psychological Association Early Career Research Award, the UNLV Barrack Scholar Award for Distinguished Research, the UNLV Alumni Association's Outstanding Faculty Award, and Student Focused Award. His many projects have been funded by national agencies such as NIDA, NIMH, and Samsung.
Thanks, Eric. It was just such a pleasure, listening, to you guys talk about the earlier days. I used to love just standing there listening to Nate talk about the old days. It was, incredible and so motivating for me as a graduate student. I basically had the pleasure of working with Nate when I was, pretty much throughout my graduate school. He was my mentor, and then some of my internship, and then my couple of years in postdoc, and then for about 10 years, 15 actually, after that, as a colleague. I was the first person I wanted to call when I got this grant from NIDA to do an R01, and he was right there with me as a consultant. So I've had a wonderful opportunity to get to know him in those kind of contexts. And then in addition, it's funny, but I went to school with his son and his daughter, his future daughter-in-law. And so I got to know him in another context too, going to these wonderful parties that were, known throughout Fort Lauderdale as being the best ones I think down there. So it was great in many different ways. I found out about Nate Asheron. I was at the University of Kansas and Mont Wolf. I was in a class with him, and I talked about just brilliance and positive, thinking and reinforcing. Well, he was that person too. And I went to him after one of the classes, and I think it was, I can't remember who it was that was up there on a film, but one of Nate's students, and I basically said, hey, that was amazing. I'm in pre-med right now, and I've just never seen anything like that. I'd like to do that. And he said, well, he said, where do you want to go for grad school? And I said, well, I was thinking Southeast. And he goes, well, you got to go down to work with Nate Asheron. So I went ahead and interviewed with him, and I know his family knows about this story, but it just blows me away that I went down there and I interviewed with him. And I remember I had done a paper on alcoholism because he had just gotten the grant to do the first drug abuse treatment for NIDA, on a behavioral therapy. And, so I went and did this literature review on alcoholism, and with adolescents, I should say. And so I showed him this paper, and I know that I was, not a good writer back then. I mean, terrible, actually. Now I'm okay. I'm an editor in a journal, and, I've gotten through enough of that stuff, but at the time it was just really not very good. And, he looked at this paper, and he read it for just a little bit, and then he looks up and he says, well, this is just an incredible paper. Do you mind if I should file this in case I should need to come in and reference it in the future? And I said, oh, no, of course not. And he always had that as a way of him to make you feel as if you were 10 feet tall and you could do anything. And actually, he made me believe him that in actuality it was a good paper. Like, I believed him. And it was not. As I watched him kind of file that paper, I just walked out of that room and I said, I've got to work with him. I don't care. That's the most positive person I think I've met in a long time, and as it turned out, I think probably my life. He's just incredible. So I basically started to work with him on this grant for NIDA, and it was so amazing. At first we had Paul McMahon and Kevin Lipinski, and Vicki Bessalel was his wife was one of our supervisors, and we just had a blast. We'd sit around and kind of come up with these really innovative, kinds of interventions. And of course, he always had a way of making us think as if we had developed these ideas, when in actuality he asked just the right questions, and he kind of just moved you in the right direction to make you actually feel that, that had happened, when in actuality, of course, he knew, the answer to these questions, 10 times back. So that was always, I thought, pretty cool. And then we had Evan Kogan and Ronna Cherno joined us, and then lastly Gordon Teichner when we did this other trial. Some interesting one. So we went through those first trials and came up with some really pretty cool results and some pretty neat interventions. And so we thought we'll do it with dual diagnosis, conduct disordered kids who are also abusing drugs. And we applied a lot of the same family behavior therapy techniques and put that together. And what was interesting is the results came up significantly improved and tremendous. And our control group, but no different than our control group in these outcomes. And I think that's the first time that's ever happened to him. So he was perplexed. Like he was like, well, how the heck did that happen? And what had happened was we had taken Alan Kasdan's problem solving and stripped it of all the behavioral aspects, and we thought, that would be a really good comparison because it has all the steps down in there, but it doesn't have the behavioral rehearsal. And he was just perplexed at how that was, so effective. Well, as it turns out, like about 15 years later, they published a meta-analysis, and those two interventions, the FBT and then the other one, were that had the highest effect sizes of all interventions. So the control group that that he had actually developed in his brilliance, he sincerely tried to make something theoretically different that would be a nice comparison, and he did, and it came up so successful. So it's just fascinating, how he operated. What I liked about, and I would like to tell you just a little bit about his innovation, because if you talk to anybody, they'll tell you that he was just so ahead of everybody else. I remember talking with John Lutzker, who was probably the person when it comes to the field of child neglect. Everybody respects him, and he was a pioneer in that field certainly. And I remember talking with him, and he was saying, "Oh, you don't know what it was like, back when he was really motivated." And I said, "Really motivated?" Because I'd be on the phone with him until 2 or 3 in the morning. As many of us had. I know Ted told me last night about some stuff that where he had to say, "Oh, I can't anymore, Nate." So I just could only imagine what it was like, back then. But at any rate, gosh, I forgot where I got thinking of a sentiment here. So, but anyway, so what I was going to say is that in terms of his innovation, what I used to love is we get to these meetings, like you guys were saying, and we kind of it was really interesting. Like we kind of sit around this table, and we basically we have a problem, and a lot of times he defined the problems by having us go out to a community member and say, what is your problem? What are the problems that you're experiencing in your agency? And I always thought that was just so cool, because what it does is it keeps your research always innovative and always contemporaneous, because you're always going to be ahead of the game. Because if there's been something that's been what we're now calling evidence-based, they would know it already, and they wouldn't have an issue with it. So I thought that was really cool. And then once we found that problem, then he sent us out, and we do our literature reviews, and we find out what kind of evidence had been shown to be effective. And he really was never interested in fields that anyone had shown, a lot of work, because that wasn't pioneering. That was just something that's already, we've got a good handle on it. We need these things that no one wants to tackle, at least initially. And I thought that was always cool, because, the pioneers are the ones that, that really are challenged to do that and want to. So, once we found out, what the problem is, we go out literature, we get all the different interventions that were existing, we start doing that. And then what we do is we sit around the table and we start to chalk up, what that intervention is going to look like, literally like a step-by-step. And then he'd send all of his therapists out and say, now try it out with your clients. And, we try it, and we come back, and we'd have this, this meeting where he'd say, okay, what happened? What worked? And then we brainstorm all the things that were working, and, then we talk about different solutions to problems that happened. And if it just happened just one time, and I always, as a grad student, you write those things up until late at night, you come back the next morning, it gets destroyed, totally taken out of, put into a different perspective, and you'd be frustrated. Oh, I can do it again? And he'd say, yes, absolutely. So we go out and we do it again until it was like perfection, until not one client that was seen by all of our therapists, we had to have no problems whatsoever before it would finally get accepted, and we then go to another area, and then, in the process would continue. So by the time we got done with this outcome study, we have this brilliant, this really cool stuff. And he always had a hierarchy of sorts, not formalized like you see in a lot of agencies, but pretty much you'd say you're the leader, and that person would basically be the most senior person usually, because he always had this importance of the person that's been around the block for a while, that's been there, that's the person that pretty much leads everything. And everybody else is pretty much the same position, except for the newbies. I remember my first time getting there, basically, they'd be asking, going over their clients and whatnot, and they'd say, Nate would say, well, what do you guys think about this? And then I'd say, oh, I think we could do whatever. And he pretty much put me on extinction. And then for a while, basically, after I started seeing clients and doing that, then he would come back with, I'd earned my respect. I don't know if he got that from his military experience or what. But then once we had that happen, it would work, and we'd kind of go from there, and then finally put it to test in the control trial. But, I know I'm running out of time here, and I've got so much that I would love to tell you guys, but, I just like to conclude just by saying that, it really is incredible, how incredibly reinforcing that he could be. Because you get up there and never, ever say, I don't think I've ever heard him say anything negative about anything. How can you do that? If you think about it, how could you talk about something so critical, always critical to the process and critical to, perfection, and always wanting, to better and better and better the process, but never critical to the people that were generating the solutions. And I always thought that was just so, inspiring and motivating. So, it just, was incredible, great experience. Thank you.
Our final panelist is David Reagan from Nova Southeastern University. For sake of time, he's going to shoot.
That's right. Forget about all that stuff on the Vita. It's an awesome individual. Very, very well-lived life, obviously. There are so many people that love Nate, and I've really enjoyed hearing from people that work directly with him. I did not. I know Nate as a friend and a colleague, and I was privileged to spend 11 really good years getting to know him. The kinds of recollections I have about him are, showing up at one of my band's gigs down by the beach, and he and Vicky dancing well past the time of the evening when folks of his advanced age should have been doing so. Taking a boat ride with me. And again, it's questionable whether anybody should be in my boat. It's really not seaworthy. They didn't care. Just an absolutely tremendous person. And I hate to pile on the positive reinforcement bandwagon, but I have to share just a brief anecdote. We have a clinical competency exam, which Brad, I'm sure, is familiar with. They are of varying quality, and I had the occasion to sit in with Nate on one such examination, and it was of exceptionally poor quality. And Nate, being the chair, opened up with a 10-minute soliloquy about the virtues of this paper that was absolutely and completely astounding. And yet, and this is maybe perhaps we can have a little bit of discussion about this, after he was done, he did offer some, I would hesitate to say criticisms because it didn't sound that way, but they were very penetrating insights into the weaknesses of the document. But it was done in a way that I am extremely envious of. I have never been able to pull that off, and he was gifted in that way. But I wanted to share some of his other gifts, and so I purposely ripped off his mentor and decided to call this "On Having an Impact," a tribute to Nate. So let's talk about that impact. We've heard a lot about the lab. Let's talk about those efforts that were not so tightly controlled. 520 Amazon reviews of toilet training in less than a day. 70% of them give it 4 or 5 stars. 2 million copies sold. Number 9 Amazon rank in the children's health area. And they sell a lot of books on that Amazon. Rank 2,836. So enviable impact. But I wanted to share something with you that I thought was particularly touching, and I think really goes right to the heart of the kind of contribution that we all want to make with the people that we serve, the community that we live in, and I think it's beautifully encapsulated by an Amazon reviewer. And I call this How to Market Behavior Analysis via Amazon.com. I'll read it, since it may be difficult for some of you to see, and it would be if I was out in the audience. I was skeptical about whether this book would work. My mother used it to toilet train me and my sister back in the 70s and recommended it highly. I tried training the traditional way first, following a suggestion in a magazine. I let my 2-year, 9-month-old son run around the house naked so he could get to the potty unencumbered. He kept peeing on the floor and crying. Eventually, when I asked him where he would pee, he said, on the floor. This is when I decided to use the book. I had some trouble getting my son to pay attention to me and follow instructions because he's very stubborn. He's not trained as well as the boy in the book. He needs to be taken to the potty. But he's not had an accident in 3 days, and I trained him 6 days ago. On reading the book, you may feel that the approach is cruel, as a reviewer I read earlier in the site did. However, you must be aware that everything is done in a positive way. The emphasis is on teaching your child, not humiliating them. Also, because the training process is so rapid, your child is spared the continued humiliation of having accidents, especially in public. And you are too. It took me 4 hours to train my son. And since then, he's been genuinely more happy and self-assured. Our relationship has improved immensely as well. This book taught me that I can be my son's teacher and that he can learn from me. It also taught me how to improve my interactions with him by following the suggestions for making sure he listens to and follows through on my instructions. This has significantly decreased the times when I get frustrated with him or yell at him for things unrelated to toilet training. This book was written to end the humiliation that most children go through before they are completely toilet trained. It's backed by research. It was originally designed for retarded children and can be successfully used on children with IQs as low as 30. I'm a licensed master social worker, and I would not hesitate to recommend this book to anyone, including my clients. And that's beautiful. It's beautiful on many levels, right? It communicates from the consumer exactly what they want from us. And Nate delivered that over and over and over again. And he had a method. And to me, that is why, as I was telling Vicki yesterday, that is why Nate will live, right? His work, his spirit will live a long, long time and will continue to do good well beyond what he's already accomplished, which is substantial. So I'm going to share with you about 8 minutes of video, maybe 7, It was done in an interview by John Lutzker. It was created by ABT in 2000 to preserve the thoughts and reminiscences of professional growth of the field's founders and pioneers. There are two clips, but they're back to back, so we won't have to stop. They talk about his animal work and its relationship to his clinical work, which is a nice segue from what we've heard so far. And then he talks a little bit about the development of the token economy. So I don't know how many of you have heard this. You can purchase this from ABT. For those of you that are teachers, instructors, college professors, it's some good stuff. So I highly recommend you get a copy of it. There are a couple quotes we won't hear. One is just a throw off, and if you're not paying attention, you won't catch it. But again, it fits beautifully with everything you guys have said. On the plus side, which is of course the only way a behaviorist looks at things, very contrary to the way many people view our field. And then on marketing behavior analysis, if it's good, you can't stop it. So with that, I might need a little help firing this up.
Yeah. That's kind of.
Very much related to that. How important was your animal work in conceptualizing healthier life?
Oh, totally. In a general sense, it laid down general considerations, and then it standardized your procedures. When we set up an animal schedule of reinforcement, I was constantly checking the equipment. I didn't trust anything. I would be constantly looking in the animal chamber to see, and very often the lights would be blinking or something would be erratic. You never could trust the instrument. So I oddly enough, even though it was all instrumented.
Hold on, let's see if we can get the video.
Oh, there it is.
Hold on.
Physician at Anna State Hospital in Illinois. What attracted his orientation that he was opposed to or favored? And I was a psychiatrist. The superintendent of the hospital was a former general practice. That the response situation had a large effect. Or to put it in more lay terms, totally. In a general sense, it laid down general considerations, and then it standardized your procedures. When we set up an animal schedule of reinforcement, I was constantly checking the equipment. I didn't trust anything. I would be constantly looking in the animal chamber to see, and very often the lights would be blinking or something would be erratic. You never could trust the instrument. So oddly enough, even though it was all instrumented, I had a window, one-way glass there in the animal chamber, and would constantly be looking in there to make sure that things were operating as they should. And then response specification, went to great lengths to try to select responses that could be objectively recorded. Always quantification. You don't just say somebody's doing well or doing badly or he benefited. You give numbers so that you can express it. So, and in terms of experimental design, that whatever you use individually, with the individual subject design was there, the AB, that is no treatment, then treatment, to use the analogy with the human level. So these were the general considerations, but then there were the substantive things, and that is what were the principles of conditioning that we're talking about. And there, the enormous power of reinforcement. That was just amazing. I could take a pigeon, a 90 pigeon just arrived from the animal supplier, put him in the animal chamber, and I would time it. In 60 seconds, I would have him pecking away at a key, working away at a schedule. It was just so powerful. Things were so dramatic, and also at an extraordinarily high rate, as high a rate, 3 per second, 4 per second, for hours at a time. And so you could see the power of the procedure. But the basic principle being that of reinforcement, type of reinforcement, the immediacy, the question of what stimuli was associated with, and most importantly as well as with its absence, because it turns out that took on aversive properties. That's where the whole notion of timeout came from. The schedule of the reinforcement, also what is it that aversive stimuli do, what is it that they're essential, and how do they compare with other operations. So all of those things were, so when I approached an applied problem, those are the things I thought of. What are the responses that are available for obtaining it? And what are the alternatives that can be taught? What are the responses that can compete with it, in other words? And in terms of aversive stimuli, when found that
effort. I had found that in the human engineering lab, and that effort itself was an aversive stimulus. You have to use shock, you don't have to use pain. The effort in itself is time out, just simply the absence of it. And so all of those things, so that some things occur in general issues, that is general methodology and the scientific orientation, empirical validation, not speculating about things without having the empirical validating or supporting evidence behind you. But in addition, these specific principles. And I ran them at the same time, as if I had a cutoff point. I had the animal work going at the same time. And you did too, didn't you? When you came to Southern Illinois University, did you have animal work going on?
No, animal work had gone by then.
Oh, okay.
Now, you and Ted Ione at Anna State developed the token economy, which is used in families, schools, institutions. How did that come about?
That was wild. I was at a state hospital, and so there's obviously a population of patients there, but there was no pressure at all by the superintendent of the hospital to do anything with the patients. He left it entirely up to me, and so did the head of the research people in the state capitol. I was the editor of a journal of JAB. I was a chief editor, and one of the articles that I reviewed was by Ted Ione, and it was the behavioral. He was a psychiatric nurse, I think it was, as a behavioral engineer. It was applying rather simple reinforcement procedures to clinical type problems in the context of a chronic ward of mental hospital patients in Canada. I think it was Ted's dissertation. That was so impressive. I had already been doing some work with humans. I was working with stuttering, and with, but I read that. Isn't that fantastic? But rather than simply trying it out on individual clinical projects, how about doing it on a widespread basis? And the entire ward. And what that meant is really designing an entire society, because this is where people spent their life, and that is to try to create a society that would be maximally reinforcing of behavior that is pro-social and constructive and adaptive. So it was actually a Walden too. It was, how do you construct a society? It meant to be faced with all kinds of problems. How do you individualize it so that individual preferences and desires will be there? How do you devise it so that the constructive behaviors that one needs in order to function in a society, in that particular society, would be there? And what could you do to go into that would mitigate against the symptomatic behavior? Well,
go on, but you get the idea. What Nate understood, that I think as a field it's easy to forget, and it's less so here than it is perhaps at ABCT, but we still do find ourselves, I think, occasionally losing our way, because what Nate did, and I love what Brad said before, that you worked on a problem and you kept working on it until you got it right. And Nate said something in there that I thought was really striking. He said, I don't care about the experimental design. Didn't matter to him because he already knew that it worked. The game was rigged, right? They already knew the procedures worked before they tested them. That's something. Thank you.
Artists, for coming here and delivering. That was really wonderful. Thank you very much. And I want to thank the Azrans for taking time out of their busy lives to come and join us in celebrating the times. Dr. Azran, thank you.